Hello all, and welcome to the UFS webinar hosted by the NWS OSTI. The goal of this webinar series is to enhance in communication and share advancements in all aspects of the UFS in both research and operational settings. I am Stacy McKell, and I'm here to help coordinate and deliver the webinar. Feel free to contact us at OSTI if you have any comments or suggestions. Here are a couple of housekeeping items that I would like to bring to your attention. Due to the high number of attendees, you'll be in listen-only mode during the event. You will not be able to unmute. If you have any questions now or during the event, please submit them via the questions chat tab on your GoToWebinar toolbar on the right of your screen. Presentations last for about 45 minutes, followed by Q&A for 15 minutes. Please type your questions in the question box during the presentation. Today's presentation will be advancing probabilistic,
I'm sorry, it looks like we have some issues with Stacy. So we'll just pass it over to you, Russ, if you don't mind.
Okay, no problem. I can go ahead and get started. You still see me in my screen okay and hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Very good. Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for having me here today for this webinar. It's great to see so many people on and familiar names. So yeah, today I'm going to talk, give an overview of the work that we've been doing in our research group over the last several years and using machine learning along with Reforecast data sets and other data sets to make some advances in probabilistic forecasting of high impact weather. I want to primarily acknowledge Aaron Hill, a postdoc and soon-to-be research scientist in my group, who's been leading a lot of this here recently, as well as Greg Herman, a former student who really pushed a lot of this forward during his PhD. Current grad students Eric James and Jacob Escobedo, and then our collaborators at the Weather Prediction Center, Mark Klein, Jim Nelson, Mike Erickson, Sarah Troniak, and many others there. And also want to acknowledge the support we've gotten from the Joint Technology Transfer Initiative of NOAA for the last several years. So to begin here, I think anybody who's dealing with forecasting of convective weather of any kind, it's probably not a controversial statement to say that we can't really do this deterministically. We can't, predict exactly where thunderstorms are going to be hours from now or even minutes from now in some cases. So we really have to do this probabilistically, and a lot of advances have been made in this area over the last several years. But just as kind of an illustration of this for an extreme rainfall event, this is a case from Houston several years ago with the observed radar on the left and the experimental HRRR model at the time on the right. And it's pretty, well, the loops are a little bit out of sync here, but this was one of the most remarkable convection allowing forecasts that I remember seeing. It's getting the changes in storm mode right, it's getting the location of the storms almost right. So many things that the model is predicting that are kind of challenging to even fathom that we have skill in doing that. But even even in a forecast like that looks so good, you start digging in a little bit further and you see, well, the heaviest rainfall is displaced a little bit. The maximum amounts are too big. We missed, some of the rain that fell up in this area wasn't predicted. And so I think all of this, even our best deterministic predictions are still, they're still not perfect. And so it's yet another illustration of that we needed to do probabilistic type forecasting. And of course, this is a really good example. We have plenty of cases where the deterministic forecasts are nowhere near this good, and that also speaks to that. Of course, this is challenging because probabilities are, and scenarios, and however you want to put it, is difficult. It's challenging even for experts, and especially to communicate that to decision makers and the public. And to do this, to do probabilistic forecasting, the general approach is to use ensembles, right? But they're expensive, or they're expensive to make big and good ones, and the data is still hard to interpret. Again, lots of progress being made in these areas right now, but still a long way to go. But that being said, there are products that are looked at all the time by forecasters, by decision makers, by broadcast meteorologists, the public, that are probabilistic. I mean, you can, for the applications I'm going to talk about here, we think about the Storm Prediction Center, Convective outlooks, or the Weather Prediction Center, Excessive Rainfall Outlooks, and you can think of lots of other examples, probability of precipitation, and so forth. So even if the kind of precise definitions are not fully understood by everyone, at least there's some level of familiarity with these kinds of products. So in the work I'm going to talk about here, we're using machine learning, and this is obviously a hot research area, not just in meteorology, but lots of different areas. And so why do we want to use this? What's the purpose of looking at that here? And just in a general sense, why would we want to apply this to some research problem or forecasting problem? So one reason you might want to do that is to do something better. So in this case, the specific example, we know that we don't explicitly predict tornadoes in models, for example, but we could use machine learning to try to do that. Or we could do something faster, like, for example, a lot of work is being done now. This is not something that I'm involved in, but a lot of work's being done to apply machine learning to subgrid parameterizations in models to speed them up, or run a radiation code faster or something like that. Or we could do something new, go looking for relationships that we didn't even know were there, which is happening in the climate science world quite a bit right now with machine learning techniques, as well as somewhat in the weather realm. Of course, the difficulty with machine learning, or the kind of perception of it, is that it's this black box, right? It's, you put some data in and something happens and you get a prediction out. And this, XKCD always has a comic that relates to this. But we're getting to the point where this is not what it is, or it doesn't have to be this anymore, where you can configure what's going on in that black box, but most importantly, you can interpret it. And so, products sort of like this, methods like this, you could think of MOS, for example, as sort of a primitive example of this sort of thing. But we're advancing far beyond that. There's a great paper by Amy McGovern and collaborators a couple of years ago in BAMS about the advances that are being made in how you can interpret what machine learning models are telling you in their predictions. Okay, so how are we going to apply this to convective hazard forecasting? So our group has been working on primarily two areas. One is excessive rainfall that we've been involved with for a number of years, and then more recently severe weather. So as defined in the US, tornadoes, large hail, damaging winds. Importantly, NWP models don't explicitly predict any of these. We get predictions of rainfall, but not much about whether it's excessive or likely to cause flooding, et cetera. And for severe hazards, it's even farther from an explicit prediction, because we can't resolve a tornado or a large hailstone in a numerical model, and so you have to use proxies or other methods like that. But we're getting to the point where we have the observations we need to do this for the most part, and reforecasts, which is critical, that I'll talk more about in a second. So we're kind of at the point where we can use machine learning to do something better in terms of hazardous weather forecasting. So again, a key data set or type of data set in this kind of work is what's known as reforecasts. And so, the huge credit to Tom Hamill, Jeff Whitaker, that group that have really pushed this forward within NOAA to generate these reforecasts. And so the idea is that you need to do a statistical post-processing, whether it's machine learning or even a MOS or whatever. You want to have a long record of forecasts from the model that you're going to use from day to day. And so that's what reforecasts provide. So they're retrospective forecasts using the same version of the model over some long time period, years or hopefully decades. And so this lets you find whether, if there are biases, systemic errors, whatever in your NWP model, that you can then account for that and correct for it in some way in your post-process forecasts. And so this is just one example from this paper from 2006 when this was kind of first introduced in BAMS. Taking a course resolution forecast from a course resolution model and turning it into a higher resolution forecast that compares much more closely to observations. Okay, so as I mentioned, the applications we've looked at are excessive rainfall, and I'll start with that, and then severe weather, which I'll come back to later. So the other big challenge we have in excessive rainfall forecasting is we don't actually have a definition for it. So we know forecasters need information, hopefully probabilistic information about how unusual for an area the amount of rain that's going to fall tomorrow or next week is going to be. But if we think about severe weather again, we at least have accepted definitions, even if there are flaws or limitations to them of what a tornado is, but we don't actually have a definition of excessive rainfall that kind of everyone can agree on. So methods that different groups use include exceeding flash flood guidance. This is kind of the operational standard at the WPC right now, or flash flood reports, because that speaks to impacts, or rain more than some other threshold, and if so, which ones, and then which precip data set will we use, because they're all different and there are lots of them. So in any case, a lot of challenges here in trying to do this. So in our work, we're using a so-called fixed frequency framework, and what that means is we're going to use average recurrence intervals to define a heavy or extreme rain event in a given area. So basically it's going to vary in space, and hopefully if we have the right data, the amount of rain that is excessive in one place will occur roughly at the same frequency as in some other place. So that should hopefully better correspond to impacts and doesn't bias the verification statistics towards just wet areas where it rains more frequently, which would be a problem if we just chose 3 inches in a day or whatever sort of fixed threshold like that happens a lot in one place but not in another. And so this is what those average recurrence. So on the left is the 1 year, and the right is the 10-year average recurrence interval for the US. This comes from Atlas 14, where it's available, but some states in the Northwest, we still don't have it. So we've estimated it from the Atlas 2 that came out in the 70s. So a bit of a, there's some limitations there in the Northwestern US. But what you see is, the values are high along the Gulf Coast where it rains a lot. They're low in the interior West. And so the idea is, we're going to try to predict events that exceed these thresholds. And then we're also going to use flash flood reports. We started by only using these ARI exceedances, but then we're also going to use flash flood reports as sort of an event in this context. So that's kind of what those look like. So, okay, so let's get to how we're actually doing this. The Weather Prediction Center, as I'm sure most are familiar with, issues excessive rainfall outlooks that look something like this here in the lower right. So it's the probability of excessive rainfall within 25 miles of a point, a 5% marginal, 10% slight, 20% moderate, etc. And so we're generating a probabilistic model output that can serve as first guess guidance for the WPC forecasters when they are producing their EROs. And so that's kind of what we've been working on over the last several years on making these products better to provide better guidance to the WPC forecasters. We have a paper that was just accepted in BAMS that you can check out more details and sort of the real-time forecasts here, and we'll come back to some examples in a bit. But that's kind of the general approach there. So how are we going to do this? So we're using Reforecasts, and in the work up to this point, it's been the previous generation, so the second generation Reforecast data set from the GEFS. And so this was the 2012 version of the GEFS at roughly 40-kilometer resolution. There were 11 ensemble members run out quite a ways, but we don't use the data out to 384 hours. And Reforecast from 1984 to the present, or I guess to sometime late last year that these were run. And most importantly, it's the same model configuration through that whole period. And then for rainfall data, we use the climatology calibrated precipitation analysis, or CCPA, to find places where the rainfall exceeded that average occurrence interval that I just showed, or a flash flood report occurred. And so we break up the continental US into 8 regions. They're somewhat arbitrary, but you know, they are somewhat hydrometeorologically homogeneous. And we don't, one thing that kind of sets this apart from some other past attempts to post-process or bias correct precipitation forecasts is that we don't just use the precipitation forecast from the model. We do use it, but we also use environmental variables like CAPE, SIN, precipitable water, mean sea level pressure, surface temperature, humidity, winds, and in a radius around the point that we're trying to predict. So I'll show more of that in a second. And we use almost 11 years of the reforecasts for training, the reforecasts and the observations for training. I'm not going to talk a lot about the kind of details of how we set these models up here, but if you're kind of into that, into the depth of machine learning, kind of want to read about that, these are the 2 papers led by Greg Herman that really kind of put all of that together. But the bottom line is it's a huge amount of data, and so that's a challenge as well, is working with these massive data sets. And so the machine learning method that we use, there are many different flavors of machine learning, but what we've used is what's called random forests. And the idea is it's based on decision trees, and you're probably familiar with decision trees in one way or another. Just the idea that you're asking a question, and then if the answer is yes or no, you sort of go down to the branches and the leaves of the trees until you reach an answer to your question. And so in our case, imagine we want to make a forecast at this red point here. What we're going to do is consider data from all of these yellow points and the red one. And so, for example, we might have a decision tree that says, and these are totally hypothetical examples, but just imagine, you know, is the temperature at this point greater than 20 degrees Celsius? If yes, then we go down this way. And then we might ask some other question in there of yes or no, and eventually we get to an answer there. You know, or similarly, is the CAPE here 500 joules per kilogram or greater, yes or no? And we sort of follow that down, and eventually we get to the end and get a probability of the past occurrences of these. And so we loop this over, you know, how many ever years of data we have, and how many ever other variables we have, and eventually get a probability. So, you know, in this case, maybe our probability we get is 50% of the time that we got to this was the forecast we had. And then the random part of it is you do this with random perturbations to those variables over and over and over again, you know, hundreds or thousands of times to get a lot of decision trees. And so, you know, we look at this over the whole data set, we look at the observations, we look at all the different predictors over all the you know, history that we have. And so we build our machine learning model that way. And then we take our forecast output from the GEFS today and feed it into that model to get a prediction for today's, you know, related to today's forecast that incorporates all that past information. And so what we get is a probabilistic forecast, but what we also get is information about how the algorithm did what it did. And so this is one of those ways where we try to make the black box a bit more transparent. We're not quite at the point where we can do this for every day's, like for today's forecast, but at least in a general sense, we can see what the model is doing. And in a lot of cases, it corresponds very closely to kind of what we would conceptualize is going on. And so what's shown here, these are all the different regions, and basically the height of the bar here is how important those different variables are in making the predictions. And so you can see, it might be hard to see the labels there, but in any case, a couple examples that are interesting here are that in the Pacific Coast region, so this is, you know, the West Coast, by far the most important predictor is the model QPF, the NWP precipitation forecast, and far greater than any other variable. And so you can kind of, it makes sense because most of the excessive rain that occurs there is from atmospheric rivers, and even a coarse resolution model tends to do a pretty good job of identifying when and where those are going to occur. And so the precipitation forecast is critical there. But then you go to like the central part of the country where convective systems are much more important, and the GEFS is not going to predict those very well. And so what we see, for example, in the northern Great Plains or the Midwest, that precipitable water, the moisture in the atmosphere is actually more predictive than the precipitation itself from the model, because basically it's kind of getting those situations where lots of moisture is available is really important to getting the forecast right, and not as much the QPF, because the model QPF isn't necessarily very good. And so this is some of that kind of key interpretable information that we get. All right, so let's take a look at how this actually plays out on a given day. This is an example from last July. This was during the flash flood and intense rainfall experiment. And so first of all, this is the raw output of the GEFS from this day. So this is the 12th of, or the 7th of July. And so this is the probability from the GEFS of exceeding a 1-year average occurrence interval, so a 1-year rain event. You can see a couple of pixels, you know, a few pixels here with higher probabilities in Minnesota. So if you just looked at this, you probably wouldn't expect a really excessive rain type of day. We could also look at it at a fixed threshold. So this is the probability of an inch of rain, and still highlights that Minnesota, South Dakota area, and then some down here along the Gulf Coast, a few other places. One little pixel there in Maryland. And so now we look at what after we've run our machine learning system for this day, this is what our forecast looks like. And it's quite different from those other ones. It still highlights that Minnesota, South Dakota area with higher probabilities. So these are probabilities, again, kind of matched to those WPC probability categories. A few other scattered areas of probabilities, like here in Texas. But then what you see is that it actually puts a pretty high probability here in the mid-Atlantic on this day. And what happened on this day, the blue dots in here are occurrences of excessive rainfall, either from exceeding different thresholds or from flash flood reports. And we see that indeed here in Pennsylvania and Maryland and the DC area, there was some quite excessive rainfall on this day that ended up being well predicted by our system. It similarly did pretty well down here in Texas, missed the location though of the heavy rain in South Dakota, which was farther west from where it occurred. And on this day, Philadelphia had a flash flood emergency, like 6 inches of rain in 2 hours, urban flooding. And so our machine learning forecast did quite a good job of highlighting that area when other guidance was not pointing quite as much into that
location. There was also flooding back here in South Dakota, but we did miss that one a little bit. So we got a hint of it, but not quite in the right spot. All right, so let's look at how these verify more quantitatively. We're going to verify them compared to in a similar way that WPC does it in-house. And our truth data set here is going to be what's called the Unified Flood Verification System that's developed by Mike Erickson and others at WPC. And so it's kind of an all of the above verification data set. It includes exceedance of flash flood guidance, exceedance of the 5-year ARI, flash flood reports, and then flood reports from stream flow gauges and from MPING. And so our verification period here is going to be a little over 2 years for our day 2 and 3 forecasts, a little shorter period for day 1. We do the verification over the whole CONUS plus for each of the regions that's shown here. And just to give you a sense of our verification period here, the shading here is a smoothed representation of how frequently excessive rainfall occurred during this 2+ year period. And it happened a lot kind of from the mid-Atlantic down through the South and the Southern Great Plains, not very much in the West because this has been a very dry period in the West over the last couple of years. So we'll kind of keep that in mind as we go as well. So first of all, we'll just compare our machine learning forecasts. So I forgot to mention this, but yeah, we kind of refer to this, the acronym we came up with, or abbreviation is CSU-MLP. So Colorado State University Machine Learning Probabilities. So if you hear me say that, that's just kind of the catch-all term for our forecast system here. So we'll compare the operational excessive rainfall outlooks at the slight and moderate category to the machine learning forecasts for the same categories. This is just how frequently do they predict a slight risk, 10% or higher probability or a 20% higher probability. And so you can see our machine learning forecasts do forecast these probabilities more frequently than the operational outlooks, but the general geographic pattern is pretty similar through there. You can see in the West, especially our machine learning system is putting probabilities there more frequently than what we see in the ERO. So that's kind of a sense of just frequency. Let's look at how a measure of reliability essentially. So what we're looking at here, it's kind of akin to a reliability diagram, but it's because we have these discrete categories, we look at it this way. And so essentially what it shows is the coverage. So if you issue, say, a moderate risk on a given day, a 20% contour, what fraction of the area within that contour actually had observed excessive rainfall. And so that's what the bars show. And so the moderate category, for example, is 20 to 50%. And so if the bar is down here below the green, it means less than 20% of the area had excessive rainfall. And so it means your forecast area was too big, basically, or too frequently issued. If you're up here, it means more of that area, more than 50% of the area was covered with excessive rainfall. And so your forecast areas were too small on average, and you want to be in between them. So if we look at this, we'll compare basically I didn't go through the different versions of our model, but these are just kind of improvements we've tried to make over time. So the 2020 version is the current version here. So we'll just mainly compare the green bars to the yellow bars. The yellow bars are the operational excessive rainfall outlook. So using this version of truth, which is slightly different from what WPC uses operationally at this point, what we see is the ERO contours are on average a little bit too small or infrequent in their coverage. Really too small is the way to look at that, except at the high risk category where it's very well calibrated. And then our machine learning forecasts are actually quite well calibrated. Again, using this version of truth. If you look at it with a different data set, it looks a little bit different. But this is generally kind of what it tends to look like in there. So this is the main takeaway here, is that this is encouraging that the calibration is pretty good for these forecasts. And then now let's look at the forecast skill. This is using Breyer skill score. This is for day 2 forecasts. This is the CSU system on the left and the ERO on the right. And so probably the first thing that jumps out is that the machine learning looks really bad in, so here, positive skill is in the greens, negative skill is in the browns. So you see all this area like in Nevada, parts of Arizona. This is mainly a sample. I mean, the scores are bad here, but it's mainly a sample size issue. In a lot of these areas, the machine learning in one time over this 2-year period issued a 5% contour, and it didn't have excessive rain. And that's a very, very bad skill score in a place where excessive rain doesn't happen very often. So the scores are not good there, but the sample size is so small that it's not too much to worry about. But if we look at some of the places where it did occur more frequently in this period, from the south up through the mid-Atlantic, especially, you can see, similar positive skill for sure, and fairly similar skill between the machine learning system and the ERO, and aggregated up over the whole country. The skill score of the machine learning system on day 2 is slightly better than the ERO. And here's the difference between the two. So it's the skill of the CSU system minus the skill of the ERO. And so you can see some places like from, say, Texas, Flash Flood Alley through the southeast and up into the mid-Atlantic, the machine learning system is outperforming the ERO in that time frame. In other areas, the ERO is doing better that you can kind of see up here, and certainly the ERO is better in those trouble spots in the west with the small sample sizes. So really, the takeaway here is that they're competitive, and that's really all we're kind of looking for. And if we aggregate that all together, mostly focus on Breyer skill score just for the sake of time here on the left. So on day 1, the ERO outperforms any of the machine learning systems. It's very, very difficult to beat operational forecasters on day 1. But as we get out to day 2 and 3, then the machine learning systems are showing higher skill at those time frames. And it's kind of similar for area under the rock curve. Again, a lot of this, the caveat on a lot of this is that we're using a particular definition of excessive rainfall, and we think it's a pretty good definition, but if you used a slightly different definition, you might see something a bit different. Okay, so that's kind of the quantitative aspect of it, but really critical to this whole process has been working with WPC and with the hydrometeorology testbed at the flash flood and intense rainfall experiment over the last 5 years, really. So we first started evaluating these products in 2017 for the first time. They had some strong points in that year, but also some clear deficiencies, and that's been key to this whole process. Has kind of been this iteration of getting feedback, seeing what forecasters and the participants in the test bed see and what they like and what they don't like, and trying to improve the forecast based on that. And so, just some of the comments from the reports over years. So in the first year, 2017, participants agreed this first guess field is an excellent step in providing a first guess for ERO, which has been a long requested tool. 2018, it was recommended for operations based on the great potential, but there were some biases that we still needed to work on, and we've made those better for sure, maybe not fixed completely. And so in 2019, the day 2 and 3 forecast models were transitioned to operations, and then last year a day 1 version of those models was transitioned into operations. So it's been kind of a great collaboration with WPC over this whole time. And so how are the forecasters using it now in operations? And so, before we had this, before the forecasters had this product, the forecasters examined, obviously all sorts of model output, and they still look at that same model output and observational data, but the deadlines are tight, especially if you're looking at day 3. There's not as much forecast guidance there, and so the CSU system has resulted in time savings to the forecasters. And the feedback is positive, and there's perception of a high bias, but it's also kind of maybe helped guide the forecasters to increase some of their forecast areas in some cases. And here's just an example from that same Philadelphia area event I showed earlier, from the day 3 up to day 1 forecast from the machine learning system and from the ERO, and then where the flash flood reports occurred and excessive rainfall occurred on that day. As an example, of course, not every day does it perform nearly this well, but this was a nice example where it did and where it could be quite useful in operations. All right, so I'm going to transition now to the severe weather bit, which is newer, but it's also pretty exciting to be working on this. And so what we did here is very, very similar to the excessive rainfall forecast, with the big difference being we're only using 3 regions here for the severe weather model. So kind of the whole West, where severe weather is less frequent generally, is in a region. And most of the predictors are the same, but we add storm relative helicity and LCL height. And again, we're trying to provide guidance that's a first guess type guidance eventually for SPC in this case. So try to make the forecast look like SPC outlook and be calibrated similar to SPC outlooks. And we'll compare the forecast output to the SPC outlooks, which are certainly the state of the art operational forecasts at this point. So if we kind of first just look in aggregate at the skill here from the severe weather model, similar to what we saw with the excessive rainfall model, you can't really beat, at least not with these methods, you can't beat SPC forecasters on day 1. Their skill at interpreting observations and using that to make a forecast is really unparalleled. And I don't think we will be at the point where these kinds of algorithms will be outperforming SPC forecasters anytime soon. But that being said, as we go out to day 2 and 3, so again, this is Breyer skill score, so higher values are better. If we go out to day 2 and 3, then where kind of the observational analysis isn't quite as useful or getting farther away from the observations, then the machine learning system is showing higher skill at those times. But now let's look at this dark green bar here, which is actually a blend, a skill weighted blend between the SPC outlook and the machine learning. And it turns out that's the most skillful of all across all of the time scales. And so this was a really interesting result to see that the blend of the human forecast and the automated forecast or the post-process forecast gives you skill beyond either of them individually, which is kind of a cool finding in how we think about how these things might get used in observations. So are the forecasts skillful? Generally, yes. And so we look here, this is similar to what I showed before, but different color scale. So skillful is reds and negative skill is blues here for tornadoes, hail, wind, and then the aggregate hazards on days 2 and 3. And so more skill for regular severe than significant severe. Again, partly those are sometimes harder forecasts. They're also the much smaller sample size there, but still skillful for the significant severe, but higher skill across. So the forecasts are skillful across there, which is great to see. If we compare it to the SPC outlooks, here we have the greens is where the random forest, the machine learning has higher skill. The browns are where the SPC has higher skill. And there's some interesting mixed results here where, for example, for severe hail, the machine learning system is showing higher skill in the southern US, whereas the SPC is showing higher skill in the northern US, similar for severe wind. It kind of flips a little bit for days 2 and 3, but there would be stippling here if they were statistically significantly different from each other, and they're not there. And so then we'll come back to this blending issue, and this just shows an example of what the blend looks like. So on the left here, this is a day 2 and a day 3 forecast from just a day in 2016. So the random forest on the left, the SPC on the right, and then the blend in the middle. And you can kind of see some of the areas where, you know, for example, you look over here in the Carolinas, and the machine learning system put some higher probabilities there. SPC had nothing there, and so it kind of tamps those down. Other areas, it goes in the opposite direction to kind of fill in areas that you know, for example, these tornadoes that occurred here in Iowa and Illinois were right on the fringe of the marginal risk for, or the 2% probability for tornadoes there. And then, you know, it's captured a little better here, higher probabilities in the random forest, and then probably the blend is the best answer there. And so then if we compare skill blend minus SPC, we see that the blend is for most of the hazards statistically significantly better than the SPC outlooks. And so that's kind of a interesting and relevant result as well. And so we can do the same type of interpretability for the severe weather models. We get somewhat different results now than we did when we were trying to forecast excessive rainfall, where the precipitation from the model was rather important. That's not as much. I mean, it's still somewhat important here, but not as important. We can see that across. So this is the West region, Central region, East region, a bunch of different variables here. The one that stands out the most for all of them is CAPE. Okay, this isn't really this, you know, kind of fits with our conceptual model of severe weather, right? You need instability, you need CAPE there to get severe storms, and that's quite an important predictor. Shear ends up being pretty important. Depends a bit on the hazard. The storm relative helicity starts showing up for tornadoes, for example, in the central region, but not for the other hazards, and that makes some sense. And it's, you know, kind of a mix for the other ones. SIN is important for the wind prediction, and so we can start to connect what these models are doing with our, you know, with kind of the fundamental understanding of the ingredients-based methods for storms forecasting. All right, so now let's look forward a little bit. Everything I've talked about up to this point has used the previous generation of the Reforecast data set from NOAA. But now we're in the Unified Forecast System framework. Things are based around the FV3, and the GEFS was upgraded last year to the FV3 GEFS, or the GEFS V12. And what's really just a huge advance here is that there's a Reforecast data set that goes with the operational GEFS now. So this is a huge advance for doing this kind of post-processing and machine learning application. And so Tom Hamill gave one of these webinars last summer. This is just what it was called, so you can kind of check that out if you're interested in the data set and not familiar with it. The new Reforecast has 5 Ensemble members daily, back to 2000. Once per week there are 11 members, but we're really focusing on the 5 members daily in our work here. And so the first step, I mean, this data set just came out, you know, less than a year ago, and it's a huge data set, even bigger than the old one. And so it took a long time to get all this data and process it, but we're starting to make some progress on that. So our first project that we tried to undertake with this was to basically repeat what we had done for the severe weather model, but trained using the GEFS V12 Reforecast. So what we had been doing previously was running the model that was trained on the old GEFS, but with every day being driven by the new GEFS. And so the forecasts are still pretty good, but probably not as good as they could be. And so here's just for an example day back in March, big severe weather day back in March. These are day 3 forecasts. The left was the old version, so trained on the old Reforecast, but driven on this day by the new GEFS. The middle is the new one, so it's trained on and driven by the same data set, which is what you would want to do ideally. And then for comparison, the SPC day 3 outlook there. And so what you see is the probabilities were increased. The pattern's basically the same, but the probabilities are higher in the new version here in Mississippi and surrounding areas. And so what happened on this day, it was a big severe weather outbreak. And I think having those higher probabilities there was probably the right, was probably a better forecast there. These are severe weather reports in the dots here. And so, I think it highlighted the even greater probability in that particular area for severe weather and ended up being quite a good forecast. And so we just demonstrated these two in the spring forecasting experiment, the hazardous weather test bed. Again, this is all still pretty new and we haven't done a lot of quantitative evaluation on the new forecast yet, but that is certainly on the docket. But this was a day 2 hail forecast from the 15th of May, valid for the 16th of May, essentially. And so we were in the experiment, there were 3 different hail forecasting products that were being evaluated. So one based on the href and the shref. This is ours here based on the GEFS, and then one based on the HER developed by the group at NCAR. And so these are the probabilities over kind of the Texas Panhandle area on this day. And so what ended up happening, a lot of very big hail. So these are hail reports added here now. And in the lower right is the so-called practically perfect forecast. So this would be like the best you could do given kind of this constraints of the smoothing of the forecasts and so forth. And so if you compare our forecast with that on this day, it looks really, really good. And this is one that we were really impressed at the performance on this day. Now, yes, I've sort of cherry picked a really good day here to show a good example, but the results were I think quite promising during the experiment there, and we look forward to digging into this a bit further. So really, our big goal here over the next couple of years, thanks to support from the JTTI program, will be in this project with SPC on the severe weather forecasting, and then a new project to continue our collaboration with the WPC is to push these kinds of probabilistic forecasts out beyond day 3 and see how we can do. Having the reforecast out there is really important. And the idea is then we can hopefully develop a seamless suite of guidance that goes from day 1 through 8 that forecasters can use either as a first guess or in whatever other way, these might be usable at the operational centers to see if we can get skill at those longer lead times. Does it give forecasters a heads up earlier about certain areas? But there's also questions of how we even do this, right? On the short lead times, we kind of know what we're doing now, but we haven't really tried to do this at these longer lead times yet. And similarly for WPC, especially the ERO currently only goes out to day 3, but there's certainly interest in going out farther. So this hopefully will be a tool that can be helpful in that kind of advance. Other things we're working on in this area, we've been incorporating convection allowing models for the shorter term forecasts. We don't have a reforecast for any cams, so that's a big limitation. And the results are promising, but kind of not as definitive, I would say, as some of the stuff with the GEFS reforecast. But we've developed a few new things we're going to test out at FAIR this summer, including a blend of multiple machine learning models to see that if we can kind of fix some of the biases that we see in the individual ones and get a good forecast there. And we really like how that looks up to this point. Connecting it to the meteorology, can we understand what types of situations these forecasts tend to fail in or really strongly succeed in as additional information for forecasters? And of course, there's, we've used random forest, but there's a lot of other flavors of machine learning that might even be better. So to summarize, these machine learning techniques can help in post-processing NWP output to yield useful first guess guidance for operational forecasting. Machine learning models for severe weather and excessive rainfall are skillful and competitive with the operational outlooks, especially past day 1. And there's all sorts of opportunities to advance this going forward, both in making the forecast better, but perhaps even more importantly, understanding how they can be applied, how they're most useful for the operational centers, how can we make them trustworthy for forecasters to better understand what they're doing. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Happy to take questions. We run these models in real time. You can look at the graphics if you're interested, or if you want the gridded output for, to look at from day to day in your AWIPs or whatever, feel free to get in touch. We can point you to that. So I will stop there and take any questions. And I will.
Thank you, Russ. Are you able to
so
see? Are you able to see the questions?
Let me take a look here. Okay.
They're coming
all right.
through.
I see. Got it. Yep. I see one from Paul Rober. Does the variable interpretation tool include variable interactions, or is it completely linear? If the latter, how can we understand nonlinearity? So, I mean, I think yes, it's not completely linear, certainly. So, but I think you ask a good question of how we interpret the interactions between the variables, and I'm not sure that we quite know how to do that yet. So yeah, I don't have a great answer to your question, Paul, but the thing that what I think is pretty exciting in this area is that this is a topic where people are really coming up with new and creative ways to interpret the whether it's feature importances or some other method. This is an area that is just really, I think, ripe for advances, and a lot of nice progress is being made. And so I think I'm not probably the right person to answer this question, but there's going to be a lot of cool techniques that are going to come out, and we will try our best to use those to try and make that, make the output more interpretable, or the models themselves interpretable. So sorry for not a non-answer to your question, Paul, but I think it's a good one. Okay, Justin Minder asks, the CSU-MLP excessive rainfall product seems to struggle in parts of the Pacific Northwest and Sierra Nevada where plentiful rain occurs and sample size shouldn't be a limitation. Do you think orography is part of the challenge? Might the ML need to be trained differently? Yeah, absolutely, Justin. So it's those things. It's the topography for sure, and the coarse resolution of the model, but also the QPE is not the radar-based QPE also struggles a bit, I think, in those regions. So I think your answer, the answer to your question is yes. If we were really interested in getting in improving the forecasts in that region, say for atmospheric rivers over the Sierra Nevada, we probably should train it differently. There's also the kind of quirky issue where you get enough precipitation in snowstorms to exceed these recurrence interval thresholds. And how do we deal with that? Right now, we actually don't, but then when WPC plots it for the forecasters, they put a mask on there of basically where the temperature is above freezing and sort of thing, because they're issuing an excessive rainfall outlook, and 6 feet of snow on top of Mount Shasta would be excessive precipitation, but not excessive rainfall. And so that's another challenge in this sort of thing. So yes, I think what you mentioned is a very good a good avenue to pursue for future work that we probably need to take a closer look at. Question from Rudolph Williams: are there any plans to implement winter weather into this? Not from our group right now, but I think it's certainly an application that could be very well suited to this sort of problem. As with any of these, the most important thing is asking the right question. What is it that you want to predict? And because the answer will be, the machine learning algorithm will give you an answer to the question that you ask. But if it's not the question you want answered, then it's not necessarily useful. So I think winter weather is a great application. There may be folks that are starting to look at that. I'm not as familiar with it, but I think it's a good it's a good suggestion and a place where this could go in the future. Let's see. Jimmy Dudia asks, is the operational rainfall product for the 1 year and 10-year return thresholds or others? Yeah, so this is, I kind of didn't go into this, but this is where we've tweaked the model over time. The first version of the model, we had a separate prediction for a 1 year return threshold and return period and a 10-year return period. The feedback we got from the forecasters and the test bed was that the 10-year model just didn't produce probabilities as frequently as it should, or the probabilities were too low. And so we sort of then just went to a catch-all kind of thing. And so so what it incorporates as the labels for excessive rainfall are, well, it's an ARI exceedance, and it varies from region to region. This has been one of those tweaks that we've done kind of in trying to correct for the biases that were pointed out in the test bed. So in some regions, it's the 1 year ARI, and some regions, it's a 2 year ARI, or a flash flood report. So either of those are, if either of those happens, it's a hit, so to speak, in the training of the system. So we've kind of done that to point towards the operational application, but I think there's still probably quite a bit of work that could be done to optimize that. Aaron Hill has a paper that's in review now, where we kind of tried to do that with one of the convection allowing models to say, all right, we're going to try and optimize the threshold that we should even use for excessive rainfall, and then kind of build the model based on that. And so, which worked out quite well, I think. And so I think there's a lot of different ways you can do that. Of course, you start getting into the situation then of like, how much meteorology are we doing here, and how much just, you know, turning knobs, and but that's I guess we're trying to balance those. Zoltan Toth asks, wonder about reasoning for training your model over 3 or 8 separate regions. We did a little bit of testing on that. It's somewhat arbitrary. It's partly a computing constraint issue, in that you have to hold all of the data over the whole period of record in memory for that. So you can't really do it over the whole CONUS, and I don't think it would make sense to do it over the whole CONUS. It might be better to use smaller regions. You know, this is good opportunities for future research. So it was somewhat driven just by, you know, the frequency of occurrence of events and kind of the meteorology of those regions, but it was also, you know, somewhat, we had to draw lines somewhere, and it was a bit arbitrary. Let's see, Michael D'Antonio asked, if someone wanted to collaborate on using different ML techniques, who would we contact? I mean, if it's stuff like we're doing, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer questions or point you to folks who are working in different areas. There's a new institute at the University of Oklahoma, and CSU is involved here as well, for trustworthy AI in weather and climate applications. Amy McGovern at OU is the leader of that. I know there's a NOAA AI workshop coming up, so I think, you know, these are just getting there's more and more people kind of exploring some of these. But yeah, feel free to reach out if there are specific questions I can answer. And then, okay, Krishna Kumar asks, you mentioned that ML training also included OBS. Can you talk about what OBS you've included? Yeah, I guess when I'm talking about OBS here, I'm talking about gridded precipitation analyses for the rainfall model, and then for the severe weather model, it's the severe weather reports, the severe weather report database. So not, you know, we're not using other kind of standard OBS at this time, other than, I mean, I guess the Reforecast is sort of the aggregator of the OBS also, in that, you know, that information should be in there. And then training differences between the new and old reanalysis data sets. So basically for this first step, we trained it in exactly the same way as we had trained it before. But that may not be the optimal way to do it, and that's something we're going to be exploring as part of this project. So, you know, the new data set is higher resolution. It is a newer version of the model, so it should be better from that perspective. And so there may be ways to take advantage of that. But for the first step, we had the infrastructure already built to train it in one way, and so that was kind of our first try. And then operational challenges while choosing the training data sets. I think the most critical is how you define the truth of observations. So whether it's precipitation or severe weather reports, we know these are not perfect data sets. It would be ideal if we had the truth of how much rain actually fell everywhere, and we would use that, but we don't have that. So we have to kind of you know, do what we can with the data sets that exist. So that's a huge one. And again, like I said before, you know, as one of the things we've learned in doing this over time is that the algorithm will always give you an answer. You just have to ensure that the question that you want it to answer is the question you're giving it, or you're giving it the sufficient data to answer that question. Because so we've found, for example, in certain precipitation data sets have what seem to be quite high biases in certain locations. And so with that, when that's the case, you know, excessive rainfall in that data set happens all the time. And so when you train a model on that, it'll predict excessive rainfall all the time. So it predicted what the data set said it should, but that wasn't actually what you wanted or what the forecasters might want. So there's still a lot to do on this. And I think I made it through all the questions, and it's right at the end of the time. So I don't know, Stacy, if there's closing things or whatever.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Russ. You answered all the questions, and I will post these questions to the UFS webinar. To the UFS portal. And if anyone has any other questions, they can feel free to email me or you. And this webinar is recorded. So thank you so much. It was very interesting, and we'll see everybody else again in 2 weeks.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Let's see here. All right. All right. Anything else you need from me at this point, or?
No, that's it. The webinar has ended. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks a whole lot.
Yeah, you bet. Oh, was I supposed to send you my slides? I didn't actually do that.
Yes, please send it to me.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
That right now before I forget.
Okay, great. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.